good morning. My name is Marian Jimenez. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a part of the writing team of the UN World Social Report published by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And it's a real pleasure to welcome everyone today to our latest session on our Spotlight on Insecurity, Inequality, and Poverty webinar series. And this one in particular is helping to inform the forthcoming UN World Social Report 2027. Today's discussion will focus on the power of global elites, who they are, how they accumulate and maintain influence, and what their growing concentration of wealth, status, and networks mean for inequality and social development at large. At a time when we see rising insecurity and declining trust in institutions, elite power matters because it shapes who benefits from growth, whose risks are protected, and whose interests are reflected in public policy. Examining elites helps us understand how advantage is accumulated, protected, and transmitted across generations, and where public institutions can act to curb excessive concentration of power, strengthen accountability, and ensure that prosperity is more broadly shared. So, given that, we are delighted to welcome Professor Mike Savage, one of the leading sociologists of class inequality and elites, to speak to us today. His work has been central to understanding how class and elite power are reproduced through wealth, institution, culture, networks, and historical advantage. His talk today will draw on findings from the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of the Sociology of Global Elites, which provides new cutting-edge research with data on elites and case studies from countries across Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the European continent. Professor Savage, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes of a presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to all the participants. During the course of the presentation, we just ask that any participant that may have a question to go ahead and enter that in the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity of talking about the interest I have in the sociology of elites. If you go to the next slide, please. And really, I think we can't ignore the importance of elites given what's going on in the world. If we think about the power of oligarchs and heads of state in driving social change across the world, we really have to address the question about who are the elites, how they're powerful, how do they become influential. Can you move to the next slide, please? Or are you stuck? Yeah, so this is the world we confront, isn't it? You'll know who these figures are. It's really interesting that so many heads of state, and there's a slide of those on the bottom left of the screen, are also extremely wealthy. And the interplay between wealth and power is becoming much more manifest than even 2 or 3 decades ago. So if you go to the next slide, please. What I want to talk about today is some issues arising from this handbook, which has been published online a few weeks ago and will be published in hardback in about a month's time. Has 43 chapters exploring aspects of the sociology of global elites, which I have been working on with Maria Luisa Mendez, who's a sociologist in Santiago, Chile, and Annette Lareau, who's a very famous sociologist working at University of Pennsylvania in the US. And we have gathered together some of the top sociologists across the world working on elites. So I'll say a few words about the issues we're exploring in the book, but also to make it a bit more concrete, I will speak very briefly about this article on the right-hand side, which was published 3 months ago. This is open access, so if this interests you, then you can get access to it quite easily. And it illustrates some of the themes which I think we are exploring in the handbook. Okay, so move on to the next slide, please. I think it's best to understand what we're trying to do in these pieces of research by understanding how we need to update our models of elites. So we're really in critical engagement, critical dialogue with conventional social science perspectives, which have dominated our understanding of elites for several decades. And the 2 iconic books, some of you may know these people, C. Wright Mills on the Power Elite, published in the late 50s, Pierre Bourdieu, The State Nobility, Study of the French Elite, published in the 80s. Both great books. But But in a way, even though these ideas of power elites and inner circles, I mean, there's a whole series of ways we think about elites which come from these books. You know, that they all know each other, they went to the same kinds of schools, they form a tight network, they often hang out in exclusive clubs, and they link together political power with military power and corporate power, which is exactly what C. Wright Mills talked about. But those ideas come from a particular moment in time. US in the 50s and France in the 70s, which are a long time ago. And they look back to a world in which nation states were much more interlocked and much more kind of powerful entities than I think they are now. So what we are trying to do in this book is recognize that elite power has become more dispersed. If you go on to the next slide, please. We're also contesting an orthodoxy which has arisen in the last 20 years, which is a kind of modification of the ideas of C. Wright Mills and Pierre Bourdieu. And here's a series of book titles. You don't need to understand the books too much, but I think the book titles gives it away. Some great sociological studies of elites and also studies from political scientists have really tried to explore how elites live their lives, how they become influential, how they lobby, how they become, and how they can make their interests manifest in policy making. And a major theme of these books, all of them in different kinds of ways, is to say that the way elites are effective these days is not by being conspicuous, not by acting like a kind of Victorian aristocracy. You know, if we all know the world of Downton Abbey and these kind of stately homes, and everyone knew who the landed estate aristocrat was. But the argument is that now corporate elites have gone behind the scenes and they are influential because they are lobbying in this kind of hidden secret world, which we don't know much about. One book I'd really recommend, which came out nearly 2 years ago in the UK, Born to Rule by my colleagues at the LSE, Aaron Reeves and Sam Freeman, which is a great study of the UK elite over the last 150 years. They got access to who's who, which in the UK, as in many other nations, gives you a register of elites. And they've been able to link together historical data on these elites going back to the 19th century. And the kind of argument they make is that, you know, in terms of who these people are, they haven't changed that much. They still predominantly went to private school or disproportionately went to private school, elite universities, wealthy backgrounds. But who's who gives you, you can indicate in who's who what your leisure interests are. And whereas 100 years ago, elites are much more likely to say they did things like shooting and fishing, hunting, or they went to the opera, these kind of highbrow things. Nowadays, they're much more likely to say, I like, you know, watching TV or going on holiday with my friends, much more kind of ordinary things. So the kind of argument which Sam and Aaron make is to say, well, actually, you know, the British elite is still powerful. They're still a kind of upper class grouping, but they're much more hidden away. And we kind of want to say, yes, there's something in this, but there's more to it than that because, you know, if we go back to the world of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and all those, these people are not hiding away, are they? They're absolutely out there. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to just briefly refer to some of the themes in the handbook. I'm not going to talk about particular chapters. There's no time. I want these comments here give a flavor of what we try and pull out in the handbook, and they run through various of the chapters. So I'm just going to say a few words about each of them, and I'll happily talk more in detail in the Q&A afterwards if you like. First point, how wealth conveys power. What do I mean by that? So you know, if we go back to C. Wright Mills or even Pierre Bourdieu, the conventional view is elites become powerful by occupying or having influence over some kind of executive power, you know, through the institutions of the nation state, governments, parliament, Congress, whatever happens to be, or through holding office in top corporation, top corporate office. Right? So power came from executive position holding of some kind. Now that's still, of course, important, but what we are also seeing is having very large amounts of wealth without necessarily having executive power is still conveying advantage and influence. You might say that someone like Elon Musk is a classic example of this. You know, he's never held official office, and yet he's been hugely influential in shaping the political, cultural, social agenda across the world. Wealth itself And we live in a society which has seen the proliferation of private wealth, particularly the top end private wealth, seems to be able to convey power, even without necessarily being linked in direct ways to the institutions of nation states. I can say about a lot more about all these points, but I'm just going to throw them out there and you can come back at me about which ones interest you. The reinscription of gendered and racial dynamics. Yeah. Just this is a vignette. For a number of years, I was teaching this undergraduate sociology option at LSE on the sociology of elites. It began in, I think, 2015. And I finished teaching it 2 years ago. It's taught it for 10 years. And it was always fun to teach. I always told students elites are a handle on the world. They give us a way of looking at how the world is changing. And as a publication, right from the beginning, had a lecture on the gender beliefs, and I kind of made the point that we tend to think by all sorts of metrics the position of women has improved vis-a-vis men. You know, it hasn't equalized, but in many metrics, income levels, etc., things have improved. But if you look at what's happening in the elite world, that is not the case. I put out, but in the early years, it's as a provocation to students, but increasingly as time's gone on, I think you can see very powerfully how that is working out. And so the kind of new kinds of masculinity involved in elite power, and the fact that at the very highest levels of office, so we're not talking about just being an MP, for instance, not just being a member of parliament, but having the most extreme top levels of executive power, these still predominantly male. It hasn't changed that much at the very top end. Similarly, around racial dynamics, sure, there's been some diversification. We have a chapter which actually explores this using quite advanced metrics, and yet we can also see the kind of reproduction of kind of, in a sense, a white upper class across the world in many ways. The role of modest consumption. So we try and look at elites not just in terms of their work and their influence, but also their kind of lifestyles. This is a really important area of study. Uh, and we're interested in, yes, on the one hand, elites who appear to be less conspicuous than they might have been 100 years ago. They're not necessarily living in grand estates. They keep heads down. They uh, get involved in less conspicuous forms of leisure activity, but nonetheless, they are still really, really important, and they still drive important sectors of consumption and various kinds of leisure industries. And we have a number of chapters uh, looking at the role of elites in using intermediaries, people who cater to their needs, you know, servants, butlers, people who offer therapy, massage services. There's a huge industry, you know, and the elites are extremely powerful and incorporating various kinds of workers in their orbit. This is partly how elite power works. It's by being able to hire people and get people working for you. I mean, in a way, this is an awful example, but the way in which Epstein was influential to these involvement of intermediaries is a classic example of that. Fourth point, the meritocratic legitimation of elites through educational consecration. So again, this is how is it that how is it that elites justify their existence as wealthy, powerful people? In the old, if we look back to the 19th century and before, it was predominantly through ascription. No, they were born to be leaders. They were born into landed estates, into titles. It was an ascriptive role they took on. That sort of thing is not really so culturally allowed these days. So there's much more of an appeal to meritocracy. You know, we've earned it, we worked hard, we're very skilled, we're talented. But as you can tell by the fact that I have quotation marks around meritocratic, we need to, you know, unpack that a bit. It is true that most elites have had access to some kind of elite education. So you don't usually get into elite positions by not going to top schools and top universities. But in many ways, that's not conveying what economists would call human capital so much as the chance to access networks and elite positions. And of course, with student fees and the cost of private education, this is also something which can be acquired by wealthy parents. So education exists partly as a kind of way in which you can appeal to the fact that you're educated and you've had to be competitive, but we also need to recognize, particularly at the elite end, that education is serving the interests of particularly elite groups. Fifthly, the urban bases of elite formation. So one of the interesting changes which we're seeing is that, again, if classically, throughout history, elites have predominantly been landed elites. Their power has been based in the land, which reflects the power of agriculture across most pre-industrial economies. Nowadays, elites often have various kinds of rural retreats, but they're much more likely to be urban groups. Their power bases are urban. They work in cities, they work from cities, they have prime urban real estate, they drive urban economies. And understanding those urban dynamics is really important. Partly, of course, if you are the aristocrat in a country estate, people know who you are. You can be pinned down. If you are a rich elite living in London, you can have much more prospect of not being noticed. Even though you may have amazing penthouses, you can nonetheless escape detection. And the final point is really to recognize that rather than seeing elites as national formations in the way that C. Wright Mills and Pierre Bourdieu did, we need to understand the transnationalism at the heart. They're all working pretty much on these kind of transnational sectors. Okay, that's all abstract, and happily unpack any of those points in the Q&A. But I've got about 10 minutes left, so let me try and illustrate some of these themes by referring to this article which we wrote. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to spend 10 minutes unpacking it in the UK case, which is the one which I've been working on directly. Um, because what we have done in the UK as part of a project called the World Elite Database Project, which involves sociologists from 22 countries. We're trying to pool our expertise in looking at our elites in our countries using comparable methods and comparable ways of thinking about who is an elite. What we've done in each country is we have assembled a biographical database of a few hundred most powerful people using a variety of sources, witches lists, chief executives of major corporations, people who occupy positions of political power, and a group of what we call elite intermediaries, people who kind of run dominant think tanks and such like. And in the UK case, we have 541 people we've identified as having the highest amounts of power. And what we have then done using various kinds of computational methods is we've looked at how visible are these individuals across media databases, how far are they consecrated, how far are they kind of recognized through the award of honors, how much do they appear in the public eye. And we're also interested in kind of following this important work by Marion Foucault and Kieran Healy. How much do they exist in the online world, and how much do they retreat from that? So it's an empirical way in which we try to unpack who really has influence in the UK, partly by looking at who occupies positions of structural power, but also by seeing who is the most visible. So I've got 7 or 8 minutes to give you a flavor of some of the findings. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. So this is the World Elite Database Project. If any of you are interested in this, on the right-hand side, there is a working note which came out last year, which gives you some early findings. And that has, I think, findings from 16 of the 22 countries. We're growing all the time. The aim is to become a global project, which we have an account of elites across the entire world. So far, 22 countries, mostly European, but we do have quite a few South American ones now. And we have China and Russia and the US. So most of the biggest and most powerful countries are in this project. And as it explains on the bottom left, the criteria we used, but chief executive of leading companies, also chief executive of many private companies who are not listed on stock exchanges, which is a sizable number of companies. And we calibrated the turnover of these companies so that we were treating companies of similar size. Then we took people from the riches lists who were super wealthy. And again, our cutoff point was whether they could, if they wished, have enough wealth to be significant players in leading companies. So the aim is to try and make some comparable ways of linking power across these different dimensions, holding of major public office, and then major intermediary positions. So the argument is there's no one elite. It's not just a corporate elite. It's not just a wealthy elite. It's not just a power elite. But we can empirically explore how they link together and their differing degrees of visibility. Okay, next slide, please. So let me say a few words. As I say, I'm going to just give you a few highlights here. So if you look at the top of this table, if you look at the columns, these are the 5 criteria which I mentioned just now. So we have elites in all of these categories. We have the raw numbers and we have the percentage of the total. And our first question was, how many of these people have been publicly recognized as deserving of public honors of some kind, given medals, been ennobled? How many of them have been chosen for selection in Who's Who, which is the most prestigious register we have in the UK? And I think the interesting finding, if you look down the overall column, you can see that less than a quarter have been given some kind of official recognition through a medal, and only just a quarter are in Who's Who. Most of them do not get consecrated in this way. So they're not part of as would have been the case in the Victorian Britain. They're not an aristocracy who are the most powerful and are also entitled and consecrated by virtue of being recognized by the state. Part of that, as the bottom row indicates, is that and this is an important point, which I'm going to come back to, but I'll say it now because when we are talking about people who hold power in the UK, who run the top companies, who hold political office, who are the richest, a very sizable proportion, around a third, are not born in the UK, and in some ways are not living in the UK. Okay? We have a much more transnational elite than you might imagine, and it is the most transnational of any of the leading countries, which is an interesting indication about the importance of the British imperial tradition, if you like. So one of the reasons why the UK economic elite is not consecrated is because if you're not British, your chance of being given an official award in the UK is less. But even if you only include the people who are British, it's still only 30% have got an official title. So most economic elites do not appear in these channels. Okay, next slide, please. But if we let's just broaden our interest now and say not just have you been given a title, have you been given a medal, but are you ever in the media? What we did is we used LexisNexis and a huge range of online publications of all kinds, broadsheets, popular press, magazines. So it could be anything really, to see how often these individuals pop up in the media. And the striking thing is, as you can see, that on the whole, people asked, well, how much should you expect to be in the media? So on the right-hand side, we have a comparison with Premier League footballers, these are the most famous celebrity sports people in the UK. So these would be the top bound, if you like. But as you can see, Premier League footballers have an average of 282 stories about them per year, whereas if you look at all economic elites, it's 13. So this is not a huge number. There is some variation between the different kinds of elites. FTSE executives, people who are in the economic policy elite, these are heads of state and such like, are much more likely to be in the media. People who are intermediaries, not at all, not surprisingly. They keep out of the public eye. It doesn't make much difference whether it's the tabloids or broadsheets or the business press. So really, a very large number of elites just do not pop up in these kinds of media sources. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that comes out even more clearly when we look at the distribution across so we have 541 elites. This is the left-hand figure here. And if we break that 541 into 10 deciles, 10 groups, with those who are most in the media on the right-hand side and those who are least in the media on the left-hand side, you can see that there is a sizable chunk of around 40%, 30%, 40%, who are certainly never talked about at all, which is really quite amazing when you think about it. You can be a chief executive of a major FTSE 100 company and not appear in news stories throughout the year. It's only the top 10% of elites who really do, they spike up. Okay, so there is a top end effect, and this is important. This is what we call the loud elite. So a small minority of elites are absolutely out there, but they are not the norm. Here, the contrast is with footballers. So there's much more of a gradated distribution amongst the footballers than there is among the elites. So that tells us a really important story that the elite is fractured into a kind of visible wing who are in the public eye, and we know who they are. We'll all know from different countries who we're talking about, but they in some ways act as a kind of a shadow, a cover for those who are not in the public eye. Almost finished, but next slide, please. Yes, and then we looked at, okay, how active are these elites online? Different ways of measuring this. We use LinkedIn. Are they on LinkedIn? Are they on Twitter? Well, it's now called X. The data is from 2020, so at that point it was called Twitter. Actually, so if you're a head of state, if you're part of the economic policy elite, yes, you were likely to have a Twitter account, as it was. Not, of course, probably not done by you, probably done by a civil servant, but you had a Twitter account. But the interesting thing is, overall, they did not. That this was not the group, the population putting themselves out there on social media. And even when they did, sometimes they had incredibly few followers. So a leading FTSE 100 executive, actually, we looked at this guy at 133 followers. So it's kind of interesting. You can be really powerful, but actually people aren't that interested in you. Next slide, please. Last thing we did is we looked at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is interesting because it's the one digital source left, which is kind of crowdsourced still. It's not dominated by corporate interests. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Because it reflects who wants to edit entries about people as much as, what corporate interests want. And what is interesting is the vast majority of elites do have Wikipedia pages. Indeed, they're as likely to have Wikipedia pages as footballers. So this is where it gets kind of interesting. There is an interest, there is a public interest in scrutinizing elites. And it's particularly pronounced if you're one of the wealthy elites, less pronounced if you are one of the elite intermediaries where you work in the background. But it is true pretty much across the board. So that's the interesting thing. Next page, next slide. Is next slide? Was that a lot? Yeah. You can't see this very well, so I'll summarize it. We also looked at not just do you have a Wikipedia page, but how many views do you get? How many people are actually looking at a Wikipedia page? This is a kind of index of how much are people wanting to engage with you. The dark blue and this breaks down the elite into 10 deciles again, so we can look at the distribution. The dark blue here is for footballers. The light blue is for people who are wealthy. And the interesting point here is, as you can tell, the light blue is much higher than any other elite fraction. There does seem to be this public interest in the wealthy. Okay? Much more interested in that than corporate executives, heads of state even. This is a kind of interesting puzzle, isn't it? How wealth, it's a bit like a kind of a moth around a flame argument, It just seems to suck interest in there. So if we just go to the last slide, and I'll summarize and then hand it over to comments. Conclusions of this paper, but they link to the handbook. I should also say in the handbook, of course, that we have chapters from all continents. I mean, there are different nuances. It's not as if, we don't necessarily agree about everything, but I think a number of similar themes. Firstly, we should not imagine these days that there is a coherent elite in any country. There are some which are more like that. The French case is more like that. The French is the more integrated elite in most countries. In the UK, we have much more fragmented elites. Some very much in the public eye, some not at all. We see, second point, wealth and policy-making elites much more in the public eye than people who have positions as corporate executives or as intermediaries. And in the paper, we reflect upon it. Perhaps this is kind of the way elite power operates these days. You get a small number of very out there, loud elites, and obviously Elon Musk is the kind of quintessential case, isn't he? We cannot avoid Elon Musk, even if we want to. And these people present themselves as mavericks. We're not the norm. We're not these kind of conventional, elites, cultural elite figures. And that's part of their allure. It's part of their appeal is to say we're trying to break the mold by being innovative. But behind them, there's also a much quieter group who are getting on with business as usual, a more technocratic elite, if you like. And there's that tension between technocratic elites and maverick elites, which we think is very important. So this also leads us back to think about how elite power is organized around various kinds of dynamics which work household level, familiar level, across different nations. And hopefully the chapters in the handbook are a contribution to unpicking some of that. There's more work to be done. Obviously, we'll have Q&A straight away, but just to say now that I'd be happy to talk to any of you privately. Send me an email if you want to chat about any of this any further. Thank you. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mike. We really appreciate the presentation, and it was really a thought-provoking discussion around, we often have talked about wealth concentration, but then trying to draw that link between concentration of wealth and concentration of power. I mean,
Mm.
two things that I found really noteworthy was your findings around that elite power has become more dispersed. So we often think about it as a maybe top 1% or some kind of coherent class at the top of the income and wealth distribution, but really that there's different ways in which this class can exert their economic and political power. And
Yeah.
also, I mean, I think for this group, just talking about elites as transnational and imperial formation, so that this is not just a national concern, but that, I mean, that would lead me to the conclusion that there's some space for some multilateral international cooperation around making sure that there is not an undue concentration of economic and political power. We already have a number of questions in the chat, so I think we'll go straight to them. What would you prefer? Do you want to answer them one by one, or would you like a couple that you could answer?
No, should have a couple, but
Okay,
yeah.
great. So we have a question from Marta in how does your framework apply to the current rise of tech and wealth elites who are no longer simply seeking to influence quietly, especially in the US, but uh, increasingly exercising direct political and media power, sometimes even bypassing traditional institutions? Do you see this as an extension of the loud elite phenomenon you describe, or as a structural shift in elite power?
Okay. Well,
Uh,
actually, perhaps I'll answer that one.
yeah.
Perhaps I'll do one by one, because otherwise. Yeah, look, thank you. Great question. And you're absolutely right. That is one of the that was one of the issues behind our thinking. Obviously, we talk about the UK. We don't quite have, we don't really have at all the kind of the Silicon Valley tech elite, but we have, but nonetheless, I think the argument may be of interest and relevance in the US case too, which is to say, yeah, so if you go back to that model of C. Wright Mills and Pierre Bourdieu, the kind of argument is that wealthy elites and tech elites, engineering elites, whatever they would be called back in the 50s, they gain power. Sure, they gain power by building successful companies, but then they have to operate within the rules of the game, using the levers of the nation state. So they have to kind of work through the institution somehow, through various kinds of lobbying or whatever. But what is happening now, and I think that the Silicon Valley elite is a classic, it is the world leading example of this, is elite who say, actually, let's just try and break those rules of the game because they're not working for us. We can do better by making our own rules. Thank you very much. And they exactly are adopting these principles of being loud and out there. I mean, in a way, Musk's role at Doge is a classic example of that, isn't it? And so we think that our distinction between loud and quiet elites is exactly trying to capture that phenomenon, that a minority, but a significant minority of elites have decided our best bet really is now to kind of go behind the nation state and try and get the nation state to change its regulatory practices or whatever, so we can make more cash. I think what we want to emphasize though is we should not forget too about the more technocratic elite, and it's not as if that's gone away either. There is the more regular corporate elite who are still going. And kind of one of the interesting questions and debates we're having is, because the elites are divided, and I think that's something, not all of them have the same politics. In many countries there's like in the US, as in the UK, you have patriotic millionaires, don't you? Wealthy people who are saying actually we should pay more tax. And I think that's important to try and recognize there are these diversity of views. But yeah, I do think our loud elite tries to capture that idea.
Thank you. And I mean, your response and touched on one of the questions I had, but just looking at the distribution of the different types of elites in the UK, the technocratic elites seem to be the biggest
Yeah,
percentage chunk of
yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah.
And so, there's a couple of questions in the chat too about like in terms of who's the most powerful within this group. Is it the loud elites? Is it the quiet elites? And then you have this big chunk of technocratic elites. So I'm
Mm,
interested in knowing, to what extent do we know how the process of like negotiation in terms of what
yeah.
actually gets put forward in terms of a final decision amongst this group?
Yeah, look, that's a great question too. So in the paper, we do, it doesn't quite answer your question, but gets a bit the way there, is we do look at what we call the counterfactuals. That's to say that people, you say that the norm in the UK is that most of our economic elites are not that are not that much in the public eye, but a few are. So we look at actually who we have a list of the 30 individuals who are most in the media, 30 individuals who are most looked at in Wikipedia, and we try and use that as a means of thinking about who wants to be visible. One of the striking things, and please consult that list if you want, but what it shows is that the people who are most in the public eye are not the classic British elite. So it's not the aristocracy, except for the Queen. So it's 2020 before the Queen sadly died. Um, Nor is it the aristocracy, with one exception, the Duke of Westminster, who was a big landowner in London. It is much more the kind of transnational corporate people. It is, and it's also people who, in a sense, not exactly court controversy, but present themselves as, rogues, people who's almost make a kind of reputational asset of being a bit, we are doing unusual business practices or whatever. So my, so in a way, that's a kind of trying to exert influence by going public. And again, I think Musk could be an example of this. Whereas there's also, but it doesn't mean that behind the scenes lobbying isn't happening too. So some of my colleagues at the LSE are also trying to look at, can we see individuals lobbying things using various kinds of measures, but that's not in our work. But I think that's the kind of exercise, that's the kind of analysis we now need, is to think about how do we look at the levers of influence, not so much by the loud elites, because we know that we can test that already. We can recognize that already in the way they deliberately court being in the media and having been part of the public narrative. But those more hidden channels of getting influence are less obvious. But as we know from the Epstein files, incredibly difficult to access unless you get data leaks or something. So it's gonna, yeah, I have no easy way of trying to unravel that.
Well, I mean, it sounds like the World Elite Database at least is a important step in that factor, just
Yes,
at least to be able to name, the different ways
yes,
in which elite power can manifest but we have a
yes.
question here that in terms of, did you find important differences across countries in how elites gain legitimacy? For example, through wealth, education, political office, or media visibility?
Yeah, so the World Elite Database Project hasn't yet. So we've done this work in the UK. We're looking at visibility, but we haven't done it in other countries yet. But that's something which we might be doing in the future. And what we haven't done yet too, which your question points to quite correctly, is not just who the elites are, but how they are viewed by the public. So it's kind of how do people on the ground, you know, value, recognize, praise, whatever, or disregard, or are derogatory towards elites. I think that's a really missing bit of the picture. And I don't, sadly, it's not enough of that in our handbook in a way, because that needs very different kinds of work. I think we need to do studies in those kinds of neighborhoods and workplaces to understand better that. I mean, I'm slightly going off this particular question, but I think it's relevant to the general issue. It is just really it's a really interesting time, where elite power in various kinds of ways is so much part of our everyday life, and yet it does not, in my view, get as much negative reaction as it might do, just because people might be questioning it. Why is that the case? I th I think it is because well, number of reasons. We have some very interesting research done by PhD students at the LSE looking at attitudes of working class voters in different parts of England towards political figures. And one of the themes coming, and I got an article on this with Sasha Hillhorst, who's one of the PhD students I was thinking of. One of the interesting themes coming out in that research is that if you go on the ground and ask people and spend time with people, there's a very strong ethos that everyone's corrupt. Everyone in politics is in it for themselves. Um, what Sasha Hillhorst calls corruption talk. So that's the kind of political discourse which circulates. So when you got that kind of that's your kind of default assumption. Everyone's corrupt. In a way, elites who may be corrupt, but they also seem to be doing it in a kind of way which is nodding to other people or trying to break certain establishment practices can also be seen to have a certain degree of legitimacy, even though it's a thin legitimacy, if you like, because it's premised upon the fact that they're all pretty bad people. So, um, whereas I think, the meritocratic, uh, more technocratic elite who don't put themselves out there and don't have a very strong public narrative are find it much more difficult in a certain kind of way to get that legitimation because again a common theme coming out of studies in working class areas in the UK is the feeling that the system as a whole is rigged. This came out very strongly in the Brexit vote, people wanted to leave the EU came out and it's coming out very strongly too in the surge of interest in the Reform Party in the UK, the populist or right-wing party, authoritarian right-wing party. It appeals to people just thinking that the system is broke. So these technocrats who are running it are, these are not good people, if you like. And so even though that technocratic elite may be more legitimated in terms of the kind of conventional things, like they've studied hard and they work hard and, and have no doubt a solid understanding of their sector of business or whatever, in terms of legitimation, they're finding it, I think, hard to really communicate to that wider audience. So, yeah, so we're in difficult times.
Yeah, and it touches on one of the questions we have too about in terms of the nature of the elite in terms of rural urban and then the kind of voting patterns that we see right now in the UK, I think in France as well, where the urban population often vote for more progressive parties, while the poorer areas increasingly vote for right-wing parties that defend
Yeah.
interests. Would you say that this think that they're disruptors is kind of driving this voting pattern to a certain extent?
Yeah, it's a common theme, isn't it? You're getting these very strong urban rural divides in voting. And as I mentioned in my remarks, we're also seeing interestingly urban spaces becoming centers of elite power. And that sense of disengagement and the system's not working for us, which comes from people outside those urban spaces, as I think it does absolutely map onto that. So yeah, I think that the elite geography maps onto these political geographies in all sorts of complex ways. But yeah, let me just say let me just say a bit more about that too, because I think one of the I'll say two things about what I think is happening in the political realm, and this is a kind of UK again, the UK observation, but I think has wider provenance. Um, it- so I had a great colleague at the LSE called Sir John Hills, who was one of our great social policy researchers, who sadly died a few years ago, but brilliant man, and very close to kind of thinking about the welfare state, and kind of how the welfare state should operate. And he and I used to talk a lot, and he and I were the original co-directors of the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. And he kept saying, well, we kept discussing, yeah, we have these wealthy elites now in the UK, but this is 10 years ago. He said, nonetheless, those wealthy elites still benefit from the welfare state. The public sector is still important for everybody. It's not to be seen just as you're giving benefits out to people who are really in poverty. And he was arguing that, for instance, with respect to how public funding subsidizes transport, and we know rich people travel more, how it subsidizes education. Again, well-off people more likely to go to education, and our health service in the UK being predominantly public. So in all these ways, he's saying, even the elites need to have a functioning state welfare system, not just for other people, but for themselves, and that's how they'd be thinking about their families. But then I keep saying, well, are you sure that's true now? Aren't the super wealthy elites we're talking about seeing coming to the fore? Haven't they now brought themselves out of everything? And he sort of said, well, perhaps that is happening now. And I think it is. So I think if you were to look at most of our political leaders and most corporate executives, it would not occur to them that they would need the state for anything really, apart from security, apart from kind of regulatory oversight in certain quarters. That's obviously contested, and that is kind of scary in terms of their role in running politics. It's a very different dynamic if you think all these welfare things are for other people. They're not for my friends. They're not for, not for my family. That's been a dynamic, of course, in many third world countries, or what used to be called third world countries for a long time. But I think it's now a generic global thing. So that's at the top. But at the bottom too, I think we're also in this dynamic with welfare retrenchment and the kind of retreat against the universal welfare state. So, with benefits being increasingly targeted according to means, that the only game in town for many, many people is to acquire private wealth. So that's kind of your only realistic way of living the good life is somehow to make it through starting a business or getting an amazing job, rather than through trying to secure wider protections. And that's kind of why, too, I made this point that wealth elites seem to attract interest. So I think, in a way, wealthy elites, unlike political elites and unlike corporate elites, they have this attraction partly because everyone wants not everyone, but a lot of people see the only prospect is to get wealthy. And looking at these people who manage to do that and enjoying the good life, they're enjoying these consumer paradise vacations or whatever it is. This is kind of the world we aspire to. So yeah, so I think there are very complex dynamics by which people understand elites, value elites, criticize elites. We need to know more about it, but I think it is bit by bit eroding a lot of democratic and kind of values about the welfare provision we've been seeing in contemporary societies.
Absolutely. Well, we have a question then around policy approaches to
Yeah.
address elite power. And does the handbook give hints about the best way to frame a policy approach if we care about addressing the concentration of elite power? And especially if the elite majority are quiet, should we place more emphasis on the moral imperative of reducing, I have to
Yeah.
scroll, poverty or deprivation through more progressive taxation on economic elites, or a justice fairness imperative about reducing inequality?
But so the short answer to that is no, we don't really discuss policy issues in the book. We're trying to lay out the sociological formation of elites, but in a way which we hope are going to be, because this question is a vital one, obviously. It's kind of what to do. It's a say what question, what to do about it. So hopefully it's a useful platform to allow us to begin to think about it. And all I would say, and I think it's coming out of what I've been talking about with the UK case and the role of wealth and the way in which now the contemporary elite is not sure they're partly webbed into politics, but the distinctive role of the wealthy elite, it does go back to this kind of question of wealth taxation. How do we deal with private wealth? But not just wealth taxation, but the whole issue about the treatment of wealth, which I think, and that is gathering, in the US, in many countries, in the UK, the debate about wealth taxation is gathering pace, it seems to me. And I think you might say it's a very blunt tool because the wealth taxation is going to affect many people who are not just these super elites. And of course, I was at a seminar this morning at the LSE, which is all about how wealthy elites and corporate elites find ways around, regulations and stuff. Nonetheless, I think that is an important precondition. It is saying that we can't treat private wealth as simply a private good. Wealth is also a collective good. It's collectively produced. It's getting that debate going. And once you can do that, you can then begin to think about ways in which you can try and regulate wealth. I mean, yeah, I just want to do a shout out to the seminars that this morning organised by Christian Surak, who's a colleague at the LSE who works on offshore wealth and golden passports, and the way in which people can now purchase second passports if they want to increase their chances of getting around the world and things. And it is clear that there's a great deal of progress has been made around financial transparency and in indexes of beneficial ownership and all this, which is important, and it is making these issues visible does give you something to work on. So I think there are various tools which can be used. I think the question of exposure and getting, because the contemporary elite, much of it does try and hide away. And we're not talking about violating people's privacy or anything like that. People are allowed to have their private life, but I think if you are the beneficiary of huge economic and social resources, it is reasonable enough that people know that, you know. I don't see you have the right to kind of completely hide that. So I think questions of visibility, tackling media power. I mean, again, you know, it is troubling how much media power and social media power is organized around the interests of particular elite individuals. And thinking about that is again part of the picture. So you won't find this is me offering some off the cuff remarks. Not much of that in the handbook, but I think it's hopefully the handbook will be helpful as a contribution to get us thinking about these things.
Absolutely. We have some questions too, again, about the World Elite database.
Yeah.
Um, and the question is, can you give a specific example of a quantitative research area for which this data could be particularly used for? And a related question is to which extent the data is useful for comparability across countries. For example, the US versus China, where wealthy elites behave and influence society in different ways, and the nature of the data differs significantly.
Yeah. I mean, so you're yes. So I don't want to kind of I don't want to, what's the word, you know, claim the World Elite Database project has all the answers. Yes, even and so far the work is descriptive. So if you look at that British Journal of Sociology paper, it is descriptive. This is what the elites look like in 16 countries by various criteria, which universities they go to and so forth. So it's a platform which could be useful base. And I would say so I would say our paper, which I talked about in the second part of my presentation, is one way of thinking about that is to take a range of dependent variables. So in this case, it was media visibility and see how far we can map on different kinds of elite factors onto that. Um, but you know, once we have a more elaborated database of more countries, you could begin to think about can you, I guess, map on a whole series of metrics around economic performance, you know, GDP, and all these things against the elite uh, distributions we have. What we are just to give you a flavor of some of the descriptive patterns, and then kind of you know to put out there, which could be interesting to you, because the argument is it does not the different kinds of elite compositions we're finding do not map on straightforwardly to the kind of conventional typologies we have to understand national differences. So if any of you know the kind of varieties of capitalism approach from Peter Hall and David Soskice and people, you contrast the Scandinavian and the from the neoliberal countries and all that. In fact, we don't really find that kind of systematic differences. We find much more kind of idiosyncratic differences. But they're ones which are revealing. So the two most transnational countries are the UK and Switzerland, which are both, of course, have particular nodes, if you like, in the international economic arena. Um, the most close, so one of the interesting indices is, in my view, is how many of the elites were born in the country in which they were elite, and the three countries. This is from memory, but I think it's right. Three countries where pretty much everyone who's in the elite were born in that country were France, Russia, and China. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? You don't get to be part of the Chinese elite unless you're absolutely Chinese. And I think so that I think we've a small n sample, 22 so far. You can't do that much quantitative analysis. It's much more kind of thinking about, I think, small scale, small n comparisons. But there will be interesting ways of thinking about military power, kind of imperial ambitions, how that maps onto different elite compositions, and all those kinds of things. But we do need to do more work to push this through.
Thank you so much. We don't have any other questions in the chat, but I'm looking through the number of questions that I have to take advantage of the time we still have
Yeah,
left.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, this question about transnational or this finding about transnational corporate people and disruptors as being so key to to understanding elite power within our own countries, right? In addition
Yeah,
to
yeah,
how
yeah,
kind of the global system is operating right now.
yeah.
And other than wealth taxation, which is, or taxation of high income earners, these kind of questions that have been coming around the conversations in the G20. What would be the other kind of levers we could look for in terms of trying to get at the international component of the power of elite?
But you mean that not measuring it, but more addressing it,
Mhm.
more challenging how we can do. Well, so yeah, look, um, and this again came out of the seminar I was at this morning. And yeah, and so there was some really interesting papers, for instance, talking about how if you try and introduce financial transparency things and you improve on that, there can be a small term effect in which companies have to comply with regulations, but then they learn to adapt. And there's discussion about kind of what is needed is joined up changes across countries in, say, the nature of financial reporting and how you're dealing with cross-border transactions. So you that in a sense will take the initiative away from some of the firms. So that yeah, and that's exactly the kind of area which I thought the OECD and various kinds of international organizations need to be playing an important role in taking a lead. But I think another thing, and this is again is a very British point. You know, in many of these discussions, the UK comes out as a major issue, you know, a major bad influence, if I can put it in those terms. You know, money laundering, the role of British legal traditions in allowing different kinds of shelters. You know, British tax havens. As we know that many of the offshore jurisdictions have a link to the British Empire. And in a way, you know, the UK itself. So you can, I think, recognizing the UK, for instance, is a particular key node, a key site. Actually, regulatory in one nation could also have wider spillover effects. And there are other countries, Switzerland's another one or whatever. So I think putting pressure on various countries which are particularly laggardly, that's the right way of putting it, would also help in thinking about trying to improve the international situation. But it's absolutely tough. I mean, it really is because there's so much, you know, so much there's so much of our political levers do not operate, you know, beyond the national level. So it's hard.
Thank you so much. And we've come to the end of our time now. But hopefully our team
Yes,
and other participants today can take you up on your offer of
yes, please. Yeah,
connecting and further discussion. And we really look forward to the publishing of the Global Handbook on elites. And thank you again for joining us today. And thank you to all of our participants.
thank you very much. Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
bye.